Megan Garvey, and I'm the instructional designer in the CTL. And I'm here to hopefully answer some of the questions that came up in our intro, and to first dive deep into what these 4 C's are. We may have a perception of what communication or critical thinking is in our classes, and we may use these elements, civic engagement, but we might not be using them quite to the level of the scoring guidelines. Or maybe we want to work a little bit beyond the scoring guidelines. So we're going to dive into each of those C's for a while and do some interactive activities with each of them. I'm going to give you examples from my discipline and how I can share examples of using each of the C's in different courses. And then we're going to wrap up the day really getting into what are rubrics, what is the difference between grading an assignment and determining what my learning outcomes are for my course so that I can inform my instruction and my course design and be part of the college. I appreciate that Diana started this morning asking about the link between the mission, the values, and the learning outcomes, because for me, the learning outcomes make me feel part of this institution. So that's my investment in learning outcomes, that I can see my role in students as they move through a program of study at our institution. And you worked on a lot of that yesterday when you were writing program outcomes for your discipline. We're going to chisel it down now to a course level, okay? So I want to share this with you first. At your table, you have a handout about the CTL. And if I don't share it now, I may not remember. And some of your questions can be answered just from this flyer, like, what is Canvas and how do I use it? So this flyer is just sharing with you some of the workshops that the CTL is putting on during the week of accountability and throughout the academic year. If you are a brand new instructor and you just need some assistance with the fundamentals of course design, I'm running 4 workshops in the next 2 weeks on just basic fundamentals of course design. And I did hear an adjunct faculty make the request that it's hard for me to leave my day job to do a workshop, so we did try to position some in the late afternoon and on Friday afternoon, so hopefully you'll be able to attend. But you'll see this series of workshops for Canvas in here, and they're tagged, a few of them, beginning and intermediate. During the week of accountability, we'll be running beginner and intermediate Canvas workshops. So if you don't really want to use Canvas to teach, but you would like to embed a learning outcome and a scoring guideline in your course, you just need beginning Canvas training to be able to do that. And you can see where that workshop will be offered, and then there's intermediate. During the semester, we'll be adding 2 advanced workshops also. The beginner workshop will also be offered as a webinar, and that will be posted on the CTL website. So there's no reason that any new adjunct or any new faculty member cannot at least participate in a beginning Canvas workshop. I hope department chairs will share that information with your new faculty. I also want to just bring your attention to this lesson construction area. So this is a program that I'm putting together, and this workshop development today was a great initiation or start to this idea of a workshop series called Lesson Construction. Lesson construction can happen over time, and we're going to be focusing on learning outcomes, which is one of the sessions I'm offering in February. And we're also going to be touching on assessment for learning today. So you can see how all of this kind of fits together in the work that the CTL is doing anyhow. So our learning outcomes for today, Diana shared these with you. I'll be digging into, again, the rubrics, the learning outcomes for course level, which is a little bit different than the program level that you worked on yesterday. And then we'll wrap up with how do we actually embed one of these rubrics into our course. The first scoring guideline that we're going to get into is critical thinking. And I chose this one because when I learned about the 4 C's, we were trained with critical thinking. And it's tangible and easy for me to identify where critical thinking is in my course. And so we're going to start with something that's very concrete with critical thinking. So if I'm informing my learning outcomes for my course, I'm going to start with 2 major things. One are my course competencies, and I'm going to remind you where you find your course competencies. And the institutional learning outcomes. That's a good starting point. But when I look at those things, What's neat about being an instructor at the college is that you have academic freedom and you're hired because you're an expert in your content area. So if you look at your competencies, there's some room for negotiation for how a student meets a competency based on what you bring to the table, based on what the workforce expectations are for students, right? And that's how we get to design courses with your expertise. So I look at my competencies and I determine what are the knowledge, skills, and habits of mind that students would need to meet those competencies. Or once I write my course level learning outcome, what are the knowledge, skills, and habits of mind that students will need to meet that desired learning outcome that I have for my students? So the course I'm sharing with you is Intro to Education. I had so much fun working on this course a few years ago. And I use it often in trainings because it's a discipline that when you read the competencies, we all understand the language. If I had chosen a chemistry course in competencies, I don't know if I would understand the language in the competencies, so I'm going to use an education example, okay? So when I looked at competency number 3, and when you do this for your own course, you should know these well. Well, competency 3 is pretty vague. Identify and explain the current issues confronting public education, including legal and ethical concerns. There's a lot of room for me to personalize that. So I like to just think about what are the knowledge, skills, and habits of mind that I would want students to acquire where I would feel comfortable that they met that competency. And for me, they're key concepts such as discrimination, social media, current issues, global citizens, and of course, court cases or legal history. That's my interpretation as the instructor of how a student would demonstrate proficiency of that competency. There's something else that informs my course, and we just talked about this a minute ago. You talked about your program level outcomes might be informed by external factors. The course I'm sharing with you for my example is an education course for future teachers. So I want to know what Mesa Public Schools, our largest feeder district, where my teachers do their internships, what do they expect from their students? So I sent an email to somebody in curriculum. I said, can you tell me what are your desired learning outcomes? And I received a 3-page letter back from Mesa Public Schools. This is what we expect of our future teachers. That's great information to get when you're designing a course, okay? So this is what we're going to do. I'm going to put you to work every chunk of this workshop that we're doing. We need to do a course inventory, and maybe you've been teaching your course for 20 years. It's okay to do a course inventory again because it's great, this refinement, this improvement process. This is really what SOC is all about and learning outcomes. So we're going to do a course inventory, and I want you to look at your course competencies. And we're only focusing on critical thinking right now. So you're going to look at your competencies and identify which competencies already require students to develop higher order thinking. When we did this 3 years ago, a lot of our competencies were in this area, lower order thinking skills. Yesterday you received this handout here, and a lot of your competencies may be written in this area. That's not good enough for me as an instructor. That's probably not good enough for you. So that's why I want to think about, for those competencies, the key concepts that I've selected that students are going to acquire in my course, which of those key concepts lend towards higher order thinking? Certainly discrimination, white privilege, social media has implications for critical thinking for my students. So that's where I can find some more critical thinking in my course. And this is what's really essential here. Students don't go from lower order thinking to higher order like this. In order for them to create something or to evaluate something in your course, they need to have knowledge and skills so that they can obtain that higher order of thinking. So I want you to just get your hands dirty with your course, with your competencies. And I'm going to give you 2 options to do that. First, let me show you where to find your competencies. Don't move around quite yet, because I'm going to give a few sets of directions here. For your competencies, There's lots of ways to get to them. I don't know if mine's the long road, but this is the way I always find them, okay? So if you go to, and you can write this down if you've never looked at them before, if you go to maricopa.edu, Tim's going to say, that's the long way to get there. Okay, maricopa.edu. And I always search, and I look at competencies every day, but I always do it like this. And I'm going to search for curriculum transfer. And it's the first link here for curriculum and transfer. And now it takes you to the transfer center, curriculum and transfer. So you can type in your course. So the course that I looked at was EDU 221. I take a look here, and it's going to pull up the history of competency development for your course. Choose the newest version. There might be 10. My newest one was 2005 or 2006, but choose your competencies. And I want you to spend time looking at these, if you haven't looked at them or if you already have. And this is what we're going to do. Okay, so stay with me. You know where to find your competencies. Now we need to make meaning of them. So 2 different options. Yesterday you made a program map, it looks like, on your tables. So you can either use a poster that's on your table and Post-it notes, or if you prefer technology and you want to use a tool such as Poplet, you can use that. If you don't know what Poplet is, please don't use it today. Okay? Use Post-it notes and a piece of paper. It does the same thing. I chose to use Poplet because it looks good for the demonstration here. So this was my process. And you can do whatever works for you, but I'm going to share how I messed around with these competencies. There are only 10 competencies in that course. Your course might have 27 competencies. I'm sorry if it does. Mine only has 10. So I copy and pasted 10 competencies. So that would be like 1 in each Post-it note. Today, it would take us a long time if you wrote down 25 competencies on 25 Post-it notes. So choose a couple that you want to work with, okay, that maybe mesh together. So I put my competencies on my notes, and then I started to read them again. Even though I've taught the course before, I was a little more mindful of what they were saying. And one of my competencies says students will create an e-portfolio. That's not really something that I'm teaching over time. It's an artifact for the class. So I moved that competency to the bottom because that will be evident in everything I teach. And then I looked at my competencies again, and number 7 said students will synthesize the factors that influence education and make it so complex. Wow, that could be linked to a scoring guideline for higher order thinking. So I moved that to the top because that's kind of overarching critical thinking for my students. I'm going to show you one more way that I manipulated my competencies. Then I went through and I clustered. You clustered yesterday, right? You clustered your learning outcomes. Well, I clustered my competencies because I don't have to teach 10 units or 7 units for students to master this. Some of them go together. So for example, number 4, analyze historic events in education and their importance and impact on education today. That should be evident in all 3 of those competencies, in my opinion, when I'm designing the course. So I clustered these together and I ended up with 5 units. So I have this unit here, 2, 3, 4, and my 5 units. That's all I want you to do for right now is to manipulate your competencies, move them around, and then if you want to start to branch out, what we really should be doing is start to list or create other Poplets or draw on your poster what are the key concepts that students would need to know for you to feel like they've mastered that competency. Okay? And if you are really familiar with your course and you're ready to toggle back to the critical thinking scoring guideline, you might want to reference that a little bit for right now. If you're new to teaching, just look at your competencies. So I'm going to give you time to just work on your course, about 20 minutes. Okay, so we need to write a course level learning outcome. You're going to draft a course level learning outcome that aligns with one of MCC's 4 C's. We're practicing critical thinking right now, so why don't we write a critical thinking one? Because you probably have evidence of critical thinking in your course. We're not rewriting our competency. We're using more things to inform our learning outcomes for our course. So as you look at your competencies, the scoring guidelines, you think about the professions, you reference your program outcomes that you wrote yesterday. What is a learning outcome for critical thinking for your course? This is the same verbiage that you focused on yesterday for what components of what a learning outcome is. We're not writing a prescribed learning objective. This is an overarching learning outcome for your course. And I'll give you an example. So for the course that I shared with you, I created an overarching learning outcome that infuses critical thinking. Relate historical and current policy for education to the social and political context of the event. Correlate ethical implications. Until I was informed and I decided the knowledge, skills, and habits of mind I wanted students to know for every competency, I didn't teach the course that well. Now I'm more informed of what I really want students to get out of my course. And then you have your considerations that you also referenced yesterday. So you're just drafting. We don't want a perfect learning outcome right now, but if you could work and see from what you've just compiled where critical thinking is evident in your course, can you write one overarching learning outcome for your course? And I'm going to give you 10 minutes to draft it. It's a quick write. Go for it. So we are going to move forward to communication. And you are all so good at communicating. Look at this. Great discussion. So we're going to dive into what communication looks like in our classroom a little bit more. We are going to go back and reference the maps that you're creating. We're going to build on those with each of the C's. But for now, I just want you to put that aside. You have a process now for writing a learning outcome informed by knowledge, skills, and habits of mind, your course competencies, and institutional student learning outcomes. Okay? So let's just dive into communication first and some principles of communication. Our scoring guideline for communication looks like this, and you can access it where that QR code is. And if we look at the definition, it says communication is the purposeful development, expression, and reception of a message through oral, written, or nonverbal means. Unless you teach communication or languages, that might be a lot to digest. So we're going to break it apart just a bit together, okay? We have 2 types of communication. We have receptive vocabulary, and we have expressive vocabulary. When I think of this C, I think, how could my students acquire enough language, have enough knowledge and skills to be able to communicate effectively what they know in my course, in my discipline? I think that we kind of advance and progress in whichever field it is we have interest in because we can communicate it really well. Such an important skill in any discipline for students. But students need vocabulary to be able to communicate effectively. And so the receptive vocabulary are the words that we understand when we hear or read them. So when you're thinking of communication, you have to think of yourself as the instructor. How am I presenting information in a way that's comprehensible to the learners in my classroom so that they're building vocabulary for my discipline to have academic conversations over time? We have social language, we have academic language. We want them building academic language over time. So that's part of how you give them information. Then the expressive communication are how students demonstrate their understanding and can articulate what they know in your discipline, okay? The expressive terminology. Now, there are 3 ways that we classify or rank vocabulary. You may not be a language teacher, but you should still want students to acquire a lot of terminology in your discipline. If you teach in the sciences or math, you teach a foreign language to me. Because your Tier 3 vocabulary is incredibly, discipline specific, and it is hard for me to decipher what you're saying in that Tier 3 terminology. Tier 3, I'm going to jump to that one first because it's probably the easiest to understand, are those technical vocabulary words that are in all of your textbooks, that are those vocabulary lists that students need to know for your discipline. We're going to jump over to Tier 1 because that's another simple one to understand. Tier 1 vocabulary is basic terminology that kids learn at home, usually in lower grade levels, very informal, colors, basic vocabulary. If you have second language learners in your class, these are the words they transfer very quickly. Tier 2 are the words that are the meat of academics and being able to communicate in an academic setting, regardless of what it is. And unfortunately, Heidi Hayes Jacobs' research on academic vocabulary shows us that we stopped teaching this in the 4th grade. Our students are getting to us way beyond the 4th grade. And until Common Core standards came out in K-12 discipline, K-12 teachers weren't even really thinking about these Tier 2 vocabulary words beyond the 4th grade. Thankfully, that's changing with the evolution of Common Core standards. But our general academic vocabulary, these are words that are high frequency. They are often abstract terms with multiple meanings, and they're typically verbs. And they're the words in your discipline that are on your tests, that are on that Bloom's taxonomy chart, that students can't even tell you the difference between, listen to this, mitosis and something else, without knowing what it means to actually analyze or compare or to do those things. So those are our Tier 2 general academic vocabulary words. So you can close your devices for a minute, and I know we have a lot of things on our tables. We're going to lay this right on top of your table. I just want you to do a little bit of terminology word ranking for a moment. I'm going to give each table a stack of words and descriptions of tier vocabulary. There are no Tier 1 vocabulary words in your stack. But I just want you to match the vocabulary word to the tier. So remember, it's fairly easy to find the specialized Tier 3 words. You might want to find those first. So, what's important in communication for our students is that if we want students to communicate effectively, they need more than technical terminology. And most likely, you're only teaching technical terms because that's what's in the textbook. So consider when you're giving an assignment or you're explaining instructions that you're helping to clarify those more academic terms. And when you have expectations for students to write an assignment or to give a presentation, that you're also encouraging them or setting up ways for them to practice more academic terminology in what they're saying. So on this document, there's a lot of information here. And I want you to just pay attention to a few columns if this is new to you, if you're not teaching communication or language in general. The first column on the left says academic language function. Those are all which tier words? That's all Tier 2 vocabulary. This vocabulary is so important for our students to acquire and to use effectively. So when you're creating rubrics or writing assignments or informing students about things, you may really emphasize this type of language in your classroom. So what does this mean, and how do I actually scaffold instruction so that if a student doesn't know what it means to justify and persuade, if they're not doing it well, what are some prompts or some cues that I can give them in my instruction so that they can justify and persuade a little bit better? And the final two columns on the right, on the far right side, will help you with that. So if we want students to acquire and use more academic vocabulary, we need to use and model more academic vocabulary with our students. It should be in the way that you deliver instruction, not in a way that's not comprehensible, but a way that you deliver instruction and how you set up your assignments and your expectations for your learners, right? And how you evaluate them. So in communication, we're being more aware of this. Okay, are we okay on different types of vocabulary? I'm going to bring in one more layer of communication. What I'm sharing with you is part of the World Readiness Standards for Learning Languages. My discipline was working with English learners, so this is something familiar to my field. Whether or not you are an ESL teacher, a communication teacher, an English teacher, whichever discipline you're teaching in, this is still relevant. Because if we shift our mindset to say, I'm teaching the language of my discipline, right? No matter what it is, and I want students to communicate effectively in my discipline, well, there are different modes of communication. And these are 3 different modes of communication that students can develop. There are interpersonal skills, casual interpersonal skills. There are interpretive communication, that I really understand what you're saying or what I'm reading. And there is presentational communication. So when I'm thinking about if I want to thread communication as an institutional learning outcome into my course, I'm also considering, are my students developing these modes of communication? So we're going to practice it on a topic that's very familiar to all of us because we're educators. We're going to think about our teaching philosophy. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to talk with somebody beside you. What is your teaching philosophy? Go for it. So I'm going to give you another layer here. And before I do, I'm just going to share a communication norm with you that you may have noticed in my delivery style. So when you think about how you deliver instruction, you communicate to your students, your delivery pace and style is important. And something I learned from a mentor several years ago is when you allow students time to discuss something in the class, a nice way to wrap up the discussion is to say, take 1 minute, wrap up the discussion. And then when they have 15 seconds, just say 15 seconds. Because it's really rude when someone's talking when you say, that's enough, we're moving on. Right? Because your ideas are important in my classroom. So I want you to know that you're validated and give you a minute to wrap it up. We've got to wrap it up, but you only have a minute to do it. Okay? So just a pace of delivery. Okay, so we just engaged with interpersonal communication. Right? Most of the learners in here were pretty good at it. I was concerned that some students weren't engaged with interpersonal communication skills, so as a facilitator, I go over and make sure that we're comfortable talking to each other, right? And engage in some interpersonal communication. But now let's look at some interpretive communication. So interpretive language is acquired through oral communication and also through written text. And we're going to acquire some new interpretive communication through written text. I've provided to you a page full of teaching philosophies. And maybe you haven't talked about teaching philosophies since you were engaged or took Intro to Education when you first decided you wanted to teach or be an instructor, or maybe at a community college level. But this is something we do with future teachers. So I have scenarios for you and then teaching philosophies. I'm going to ask you to read through that handout, because this may be unfamiliar to you. And when you finish reading or while you're reading, you also have a note guide. So you are informing your interpretation of teaching philosophies. I'd like for you to fill out the note guide. And then if we want to add some language skills, some English skills here, and you feel comfortable, you can create a metaphor for your teaching philosophy. So about 12 minutes to read through the teaching philosophies, take your notes, and refine what it means, and you will be acquiring academic vocabulary to explain your teaching philosophy in more technical terms. I'm going to bring this back to this course design and learning outcomes. So the course I chose to share with you was an Intro to Education course. And two of the major learning outcomes for that course that my colleagues and I had talked about this before was, we want students by the end of this course to know, do I want to be a teacher? Yes or no? And what's my teaching philosophy? That's kind of a major overarching thing of that course. And the do I want to be a teacher needs to be informed by all of the critical issues, the current issues, the complex issues of education. Because that kind of informs me about whether or not I even want to go into this industry, right? And then communicate my teaching philosophy. So when I think about linking an institutional learning outcome, communication is fairly a natural connection for me with that course. But what I thought about, if I want students to be able to articulate one of those two things, what are the knowledge, skills, and habits of mind they need to know to do that? So keep going back to that. Even though we're talking about kind of competencies and institutional learning outcomes, you still, it's important to kind of map out or know those knowledge, skills, and habits of mind. So for me in that discipline, if students are going to communicate effectively why or why not I want to go into this industry, what is my teaching philosophy, the knowledge they need to know is the content of the discipline and their vocabulary. They need a lot of rich vocabulary to communicate it well. Skills they need to know are discussion skills, listening skills, pace, tone, if I'm going to have them present this. And habits of mind, they need to consider their audience and their values and beliefs about education to really communicate that well. So I want you to go back to your course map that you started. We have about 10 minutes, 12 minutes before lunch. And go back and look at those themes and competencies and the different components that inform your course design. And consider, is there a key concept in your course for students to demonstrate effective communication? Okay? And what knowledge, skills, and habits of mind would students need to purposefully develop a message orally, non-verbally, or through written communication? So now you're just looking at that mind map in regard to communication. And is there something that stands out to you? So we have 2 C's that we're going to dive into this afternoon, and then we're going to wrap up the day, as I promised, looking at rubrics and how you actually put these learning outcomes into your course. So we're starting with civic engagement. And can you hear me on this one? Yeah, okay. So why not start after lunch with a little prior knowledge quiz here, a little prior knowledge activity. So at your table, I passed out half sheets of paper that are face down. This is an individual learning assignment, which means you're not using your neighbor as a resource. On your own, you have a closed note template with a word bank. And I'd just like for you to familiarize yourself with the Maricopa definition of what civic engagement, what service learning is in our district. See what you know already. Service learning, for me, was difficult because I thought, oh, I have to put together a project out in the community. And I wasn't really invested in it for quite a while. And I did projects because my course said your students have to do 30 hours in a high school classroom. And I thought, awesome, I'm covered for service learning. But if I look at that definition, that's not really not enough for me. It doesn't satisfy me. I think it's interesting that the way Maricopa shapes service learning here is looking at how I acquire my newly acquired skills and knowledge for real life situations in my community, but it's a whole lot about putting words into action and values and belief and doing something for a purpose. So I'm just going to share with you how I shifted from just sending students out to do 30 hours of classroom observations to a civic engagement type of a project, based on being informed on more things than course competencies. So the course that I'm going to relate to, and let me show you the scoring guideline first for civic engagement. So this is the scoring guideline for civic engagement. If this is something that you connect with during the workshop and you feel like, gosh, there's something in my class that I'm ready for my students to put words into action and to do something in the community, then this is the scoring guideline that you want to reference and maybe infuse into one of your courses. So the course I'm going to share with you for this is a course that I taught called Introduction to English Learners. And I've been teaching ESL for almost 20 years. And when I taught Foundations of ESL, I just taught theories of language acquisition, and I didn't get so much into the political, civic engagement activist experience until I had kind of changed my role and I got to travel and find out what was happening nationally and not locally with English learners. And so I learned about, I followed some different research, some national research on characteristics of effective programs for language learners. And prior to that, I just taught what I knew from my experience. I wasn't informed by more national research. So the one thing I did to start instilling this understanding of a more national understanding of what happens to language learners is I changed the book in the course. So I went to all open education resources instead of the textbook, and then if you have an open course that's less than $40, I adopted a Thomas and Collier research book for my students because I wanted them to have current national research as future teachers. So that's one way I started to shift the habits of mind for my students to understand what was really happening to English learners nationally and then to figure out what was happening locally. So from that text, I put together a lesson on characteristics of effective programs for ELLs. And it is a lesson where they need certain knowledge, skills, and habits of mind to be successful in this lesson. They need the knowledge of characteristics of the effective programs that are outlined by Thomas and Collier, and they need the knowledge to understand theories of language acquisition, right? So when you did your map, or when I did my map, that's kind of the knowledge that they would need to understand there. The skills, my students needed reading skills to comprehend this text. And because my learners are at all different lexile, and yours are the same way, unless you're teaching an advanced course, you may have students that need embedded reading strategies in your classes. So I needed them to digest some pretty important information, so I had to put together a lesson that taught them reading strategies also so they could digest the text. My students needed to know how to interpret graphs because it's pretty heavy stuff that we're talking about, and they needed to develop some skills to negotiate because ultimately they were going to justify and advocate for ELLs in Arizona. I also wanted to shape their habits of mind for social justice. That if I'm going to be a teacher of English learners, I probably need to have a heart of advocacy. And I need to understand equal education opportunities, social justice, and what's happening in Arizona. So I put together a lesson, and my students determine the best programs for ELLs, and they find out through inquiry that Arizona is the lowest performing model in the country. We are one of 3 states in the country that is English only: Arizona, California, and Massachusetts, and California is now rejecting their English only policy. Our ELLs are not performing well at the K-12 level at all. They also learned that dual language immersion programs are the most effective programs for language learners and other students. So we started to investigate dual language immersion programs. This is all the stuff I had to do to get them to be informed enough to go out in the community and advocate. But what was nice is it still aligns to my course competencies. So we had to focus on dual language immersion. But what was happening in Arizona with dual language immersion? So There are tons of dual language programs that are surfacing all over the state of Arizona. And they're serving English-speaking kids from predominantly middle-class and high-income families. And English learners who are native Spanish speakers are not allowed to even go into the programs. So this is a social justice issue that we have on our hands. And we talk about one population of students being privileged to have 2 languages and one population who's losing a language. So for my civic engagement activity for my students, they were able to investigate the seal of biliteracy. And we actually met at the state capitol when the seal of biliteracy was being passed. And we were able to see what's transforming in Arizona and how is this affecting English learners in our community. So I'm sharing this example with you because I went from just teaching theories and kind of characteristics of students and the value of culture and language to me being informed about national research and what was happening in Arizona to start to change knowledge, skills, and habits of mind for my students for civic engagement, okay? For our purposes for civic engagement, because I think it's so complex, we have a fabulous Center for Community and Civic Engagement that Dwayne Oakes is the head of this center, and you can have access to determine different ways that your students can be involved. But I'd like for you just to think about your course, because I can't really inform you about civic engagement projects for your course. But maybe go back now to your map, spend a little bit of time, and see, are there competencies, not just competencies, but are there key concepts and things from the outside that are informing the way you teach your course that could lend to civic engagement projects? Okay? Take 10 minutes, and I want you to look at your course again from a civic engagement lens. Okay, we made it to the 4th C. Woo! It's exciting, guys. This is a long presentation. 2 more parts. Okay. So, this is my favorite one to talk about, cultural and global engagement. Because I'm that girl right now that's in a school program, and my topic of interest is serving culturally and linguistically diverse students. And I take a lot of critical race classes, and I'm just kind of, this is on my mind all the time. This C links so well to our initiative to be a Hispanic serving institution. And I don't want to limit our conversation in any way to only serving Hispanic students. But if you're engaged in those action teams, this is a really nice C to be engaged with. What's so lovely about your GPS workshop and this one is that it makes us part of this awesome community of MCC, and we figure out how we make these connections to be part of the institution. Whether you're here full-time or part-time, this makes us all connected, these big college initiatives. So, cultural and global engagement. We had an HSI workshop last week, and we broke into action teams. HSI, for those of you who don't know, means that we are intentional in everything that we do to serve a population of students that is rapidly growing in our institution. In the way that we communicate and serve and teach and outreach, that's what HSI is about. It's about being very intentional in all of our practice, including our instructional practice. So the HSI team got together in one group, I don't know what their topic is, but they said, gosh, we just went through the stages of implementation and we realized we don't all agree on what diversity even is. What does it mean? So the purpose of our workshop today, only because I'm engaged in reading a bunch of journals on diversity, I'm going to share with you kind of a shared understanding of what we'll define culture and diversity as. This is our scoring guideline for cultural and global engagement. And well, we'll get back to how we might be able to use this for an assignment or for a learning outcome in our course. But just to get started, our shared knowledge of culture. So So Geneva Gay is a lead researcher in critical race and culturally responsive teaching. She leads kind of the work on culturally responsive teaching is what we call this. And she defines culture as values and beliefs, customs and traditions, heritage and contributions, experiences and perspectives. We all have a variety of background, experiences, culture that we contribute to this community, to this learning institution. She categorizes diversity as race, culture, and ethnicity. Some folks really like to focus on those three pillars of diversity. But there are other pillars of diversity also, including gender, sexual orientation, social class, or linguistic. So if you're a researcher in this field, you may lean towards one of those areas of culture or diversity. If you're an instructor and you want to infuse cultural and global awareness in your classes, you may lean on one of those if it's a little more relevant in your discipline. Guess which one I lean on for 220? Race, culture, ethnicity, and linguistic, right? I'm looking at that diversity. Okay, so culturally responsive teaching. I kind of just summarized culturally responsive teaching into three main statements for you. Culturally responsive teaching from the instructor's point of view. I'm going to read these. And I haven't read any PowerPoints so far, so I'm going to read this slide because we need to digest this. I take time to learn about the cultures represented by the students in my classroom. So you can do that with institutional data. You could have an assignment at the beginning of the class where students are sharing about their culture. It can be threaded throughout different assignments that you're doing. But you're informing yourself about the different cultures of the students in your classroom, which could be general MCC or those learners that you have every semester. I recognize and consider my own cultural influences and how they affect the way I communicate my expectations and how I teach. Guess what? We teach and say what we know and who we are. I read an article that just talked about that we become our discipline. So much of ourselves is evident when we teach. So regardless of what discipline you're teaching, your background and your experiences, your cultural views are coming out, whether you want them to or not. They come out when you teach. But we need to have an awareness of what our cultural values are and who we are so that we know when those are not meshing with the cultures of the students in our classroom. It's important to know our own culture. And then I plan my lessons to capitalize on my students' cultures and my experiences. That's a really big task. But if you're going to infuse cultural and global competency in your classes, you're actually thinking about the assignments I'm teaching and how can I engage this in a way that my students are having different perspectives or different experiences where we can capitalize on their culture. So what I haven't found in literature is what culturally responsive learning is. So I adapted it from culturally responsive teaching. So this is Megan's idea of culturally responsive learning. That maybe for a student, I take time to learn about the cultures represented within each discipline that I study. So if my instructor gives me an assignment, I'm not going to do that naturally. You actually have to set up in a way where it's becoming a habit of mind to engage with other cultures when they're learning, right? This habit of mind of who we are. A learner may say, I recognize and consider my own cultural influences and how they affect the way I organize and explain my understanding of new concepts. Until I took a class on white privilege last summer, I didn't realize my experiences, how they influence the way I organize new inputs. And I didn't realize how our institution of education, not the institution of MCC, but education itself, organizes things based on certain privileges and biases. But I need to be aware of that. And I complete assignments that are inclusive of the perspectives and experiences of cultures different from my own. How interesting if a student could complete an assignment where they not only gave it from one perspective, but another perspective where they learned from somebody else. So another artifact that's out there I think that the psychology department is actually engaged with this culturally proficiency continuum. This is a way that you can kind of gauge where an institution is at on a proficiency of culture. So we go from destruction to proficiency, and I'd like for us to look at this two different ways. So the first one I'm going to talk about is very generic in regard to education. So I've told you my background and what I teach, and I can tell you that right now, that example I gave you about dual language programs, what's happening? White privileged kids are learning someone's language, and heritage speakers are losing their language. So the achievement gap gets bigger, the socioeconomic divide gets bigger, we create bigger gaps in social classes. That's destruction. That is a representation of destruction when you're taking something from somebody else and giving it to a privileged audience. So that is one example of a discipline area where we need to grow and change in our proficiency of culture. So I'm going to ask you to engage in a little bit of a conversation that may be new to your discipline. And think about either in your discipline, where is your discipline positioned on the cultural proficiency continuum? The field of education can talk about this well because it's a very known discipline for engaging in discussions about culture. But you may have to think of your own a little bit differently. I don't want you to talk about how your colleague rates on this proficiency continuum. We're talking about mathematics and English, because there's probably some bias in those fields where we're not where we want to be on the culturally proficient continuum. In fashion, think about where we actually are in our field. I provided a resource to you that kind of details a little bit more what this proficiency means and how you can digest and understand the continuum. So again, we are talking general about our discipline and where our discipline falls. Maybe at home or with a colleague that you feel comfortable talking with. Think about, where am I on the culturally proficient continuum? Okay? So take a few minutes and just talk about your discipline. I had some people ask for some clarification or examples of some others. And I'm going to give you two examples here. So I gave you an eliminate differences example. That's a pretty clear one that's going on right now. And that's just in education in general. But let's not even think about your discipline right now. Let's just think about education, okay? So if we think about an example for incapacity, demeaning differences. So it's belief in the superiority of one's culture and behavior that disempowers another's culture. You know the notion that you're here so you should conform to our ways? That's demeaning. This is the macro culture. This is the dominant culture. So you have like dominant cultures and minoritized cultures. The dominant culture, if the dominant says that you have to conform, completely assimilate, you're saying one is better than the other. It's a superiority. The dismissed differences could be cultural blindness that, well, it's not even an issue. If we don't talk about it, it's not an issue. HSI is a little bit like that. We said it is an issue. If we have 30% of our student population here who are Hispanic, it's important. Their culture, their background is important, and we're going to be actively engaged in serving them well. Blindness means the same is good for everyone. Equal education means equal is not the same for everyone. It means that we respond to different students' needs based on their background experiences. Okay? So I'm going to put some other questions up just to kind of help with the discussion. So as you're thinking about your discipline, please do not respond to all of these, but you can choose one or two that maybe would resonate at your table to look at conversations along the continuum. So the first 4 questions are just kind of about the continuum in our institution. where you can categorize them on that scale, and then examine your barriers. What barriers do we have in regard to moving across the continuum? Okay? So, let's think back to our course. So in our courses, which key concepts foster opportunities for students to apply cultural awareness to human interaction and expression? The class I shared with you before, we did a civic engagement lesson on an issue that was happening politically for English learners. But that didn't pull on their heartstrings so they could experience what was it like to be in a dual language classroom. And I couldn't take them to a dual language classroom, but I wanted them engaged with culture and global awareness. So we read the book, Diary of a Bilingual School, and we Skyped the author in, and we really engaged and experienced to see what it means to live in two languages, so that the picture was painted, and they were able to kind of engage more in this cultural aspect of the course. So the books you choose to read, the articles, the assignments, the perspectives that you share, this is how you start to shift and be more intentional about cultural and global awareness in your classes. What knowledge, skills, and habits of mind should students develop to acquire authentic cultural competency? I don't know that I would go over the cultural competency proficiency scale with my students, but how can we start to shift the mindset of our discipline to be a little bit more culturally competent? So think about that in your planning, in the resources you choose, and how you facilitate instruction. I'd like to give you just about 5 minutes to look at your map again and see, is there an area that lends towards cultural and global engagement for the course that you're looking at? I'm going to assume that it's good that we shifted from independent course planning to table conversations about courses, but know that our work today is really bringing you to a course level of how you can infuse one of these learning outcomes into your course, okay? So maybe one of these 4 resonated with you and you want to try them out in your course. I'm going to spend the last 45 minutes of our workshop really getting into this idea of rubrics and selecting a learning outcome for your course, and then how we actually link a learning outcome to a rubric so that we have some institutional data for, what was Diana saying? What do we need? Tom? Substantial participation. We have excellent participation in this room. So this is the type of participation that we need for learning outcomes. Okay, so I'm going to be touching on some of the components of that workshop that I'll be facilitating later on in this year on assessment for learning as part of this preview today. Oh, isn't that nice? I forgot I put this up here. Okay, so we've covered a lot of the content. We've really focused on the ISLOs for learning outcomes, and we're touching on assessment for learning. I don't want this to distract you from attending these workshops, because this will be a great series if you want to have a more kind of personalized opportunity to work on your course. So for this workshop, we are going to provide opportunities for students to organize and express ideas to demonstrate understanding of desired learning outcomes. This is the whole idea of assessment for learning. And for us with learning outcomes, we're getting at assessment for planning and assessment for informed instruction. A model that we use at our college is the informed improvement model. Has anyone seen this before? I love it. So this is the informed improvement model that we have at our college, and we use this for institutional effectiveness. When I put together large-scale projects or workshops or programs like this, I try to figure out, does this fit into the model? And I think it definitely does, what we're doing with learning outcomes. So let me show you how I think this fits into the model for you as instructor. So we have an II course level ISLOs process. Okay? Informed improvement. I'm using data to inform my instructional practice. I'm using data to inform my course design. Okay, course level. So what does this look like? I'm going to ask a question. How can I use ISLOs to inform instruction? Research elements that inform course level learning outcomes with the end in mind. So you know you want to use an ISLO to inform instruction, but which one do you want to use? You have to research to figure out which one is best for your course. Look at your competencies, the ISLOs, transfer guides, your program outcomes, workforce things, those external factors that should influence your course. Then you're gonna choose one and develop or refine an assignment and include a measurement tool, which we call a scoring guideline, that we link to the rubric. The learning outcome is not used to grade the assignment. It's used to inform you about that large learning outcome that you have for the course. Did my students meet that learning outcome? Pilot the assignment or assessment, including the measurement tool. And I put here 10% rule. I'm going to tap into a workshop that I attended at InstructureCon this summer, and the presenters talked about the 10% rule. Anytime you try a rubric out, you're not going to get it right the first time. I read an article recently about the folklore of educators, that there's this folklore that we are all experts and excellent at what we do. We're actually great at what we do because we believe in learning and a refinement process. So when you take a risk and try something new, it's not going to go well the first time, probably. And at least there'll be a 10% margin of error. So if you're going to try out a rubric or something, know that you're going to need to adjust it a little bit. It's normal. And then analyze the data and refine my course after you collect this data and set professional development goals. This is about you as an instructor and our institution having 1 or 4 ways that we're assessing our learning outcomes as an institution. Okay, so this is a resource I want to share with you, and I'm going to navigate this way so that you know what this is. This is called Canvas Community. If you're not using Canvas yet, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to see you in one of these workshops or on a webinar, because you can do this. So when you start using Canvas, you want to know about this resource called Canvas Community. So you can go to this website, and on here, there was a fabulous conference this summer in Keystone, Colorado. And they have all of the resources posted on this blog. So I'm going to just show you how I've found this resource again. I clicked on the blog, and I'm going to type in rubrics. Because I attended this awesome session called Hacking Rubrics Experience. And I talked to my boss, my director, and I said, do you think I could just show their presentation? Why would I invent something new? And she agreed that we should just show this one. Okay, so this is what we learned from these instructional designers at Penn State. So rubrics. People are all over the spectrum about why we should use rubrics and whether or not they're effective or not effective. What we do know is that some things that you measure in your class are objective. There's a black and white right or wrong answer. And you usually grade that with a multiple choice something, or there's just a way that you can grade that, and it's very objective. But there are subjective things in your class that you measure also. And unless you have a model example to give your students or the most clear expectations in the world, so your students know exactly when you looked at it, it was a C, then it's not very fair to say if it was a C if they didn't know why it should have been an A or a B or a C. So this is why we use rubrics, okay, to evaluate something that's a little bit more subjective. I've always used analytic rubrics, and I think a lot of my colleagues have. This workshop was awesome because they shared 4 types of rubrics with you. So wherever you are in the spectrum of grading assignments, maybe one of these rubrics will work with you. And I'm telling you this because for the purpose of institutional learning outcomes, you're going to have a learning outcome for your course, And you're going to choose one artifact towards the end of your course that will allow your students to demonstrate that they've mastered that learning outcome for your course. But in order for our institution to collect that data, we need you to link it to a rubric. So if you hate rubrics, you have to use one. So I'm going to give you 4 choices of a rubric that you can use, okay? And you might start liking them. What is a rubric? A coherent set of criteria for students' work that includes descriptions of levels of performance quality on the criteria. So 4 types of rubrics we're looking at. Oh, picture time. What is a rubric? What is a rubric? Oh, I love it. That's great. Okay. So we have single point, analytic, primary trait, and holistic. Stay with me. Not only am I going to tell you a rubric, there are 4 types of rubrics that you can use. Okay, single point rubric. A single point rubric focuses on proficiency. It has less verbiage than an analytic rubric. It's not a lot of time to create because you don't have all of the details in the criteria, okay? The areas are kind of open-ended because you write in the notes. It takes a little more time for grading than an analytic rubric, okay? So an analytic rubric, more work up front. A single point rubric, a little more simple to design, but you need to give a little bit more feedback on it. So it looks like this. You have your criteria for the task. So this assignment is worth 100 points. And I'm going to evaluate you on A, B, and C. And if you don't meet my expectation for A, I'm going to take away 5 points. And if you meet it, I'm going to give you 5 points. But you need to tell them why they didn't meet it or they did meet it. So in this whole process, when we're talking about grading assignments, students need to know, 1, what is the expectation, and how close am I to that expectation? Because if you say you didn't get ideas correct, well, what are you talking about? What did I miss on that? So you need to be able to let them know what they missed. They have a nice example on here. So this is an English example for a writing assignment using 6 traits. So here you would put your criteria, the 6 traits, if you use that for writing. If they didn't meet it, you'd mark the left side and tell them why. And then if they did meet it, evidence of how you met it, or maybe it's even advanced. I thought it was nice they had a recommendation, and I'm going to kind of extend this a little bit. If you like to use student self-evaluation for a project, let's say you have a big project in your class, you want students to kind of work along the way and then evaluate how close they are before they finish it. You could have them fill out this one on the side on the right. It has a checklist and the criteria, and they can kind of figure out, am I close to finishing this project yet? Did I meet all the criteria? Okay? Single point. This is what it looks like in Canvas. Some of these are funky in Canvas because of the way that Canvas is limited in the type of rubrics. But you would set it up where you would have your criteria, and they would either really get the 5 or the 0 for each criteria. But you need to tell them why. Okay? You know how you give student feedback in Canvas? If not, you can come to a workshop. Okay, analytic rubrics. These are the ones that many of us use. The scoring guidelines are analytic rubrics. They give you the criteria and detailed description for each criteria. It breaks down every task. It says how you did not meet, you meet, or you exceed, and you provide a point value to each. So ultimately, it looks like this. We're probably most familiar with an analytic rubric. My criteria, all my descriptors, and they can be all over the scale on this. They might get a 3 on criteria 1, a falls below on criteria 2, but the grade is a cumulative score, right? We're familiar with this kind. This is very easy to set up in Canvas, and you can even weight the different criteria. This is what it looks like in Canvas. Primary trait rubrics. So these will break, it says breaks down the tasks, and we score from the bottom up. So it looks like this. Let's say that you decided that you were going to link a rubric to a discussion. And this is the ultimate goal for the discussion. You have a very clear criteria. If they do all of those things, they get a 4. But then you have to show them, if you miss one thing, this is a 3, a 2, and a 1. But it's supposed to build up. So number 4, if they get a 4 on the rubric, that means they did everything below. Okay? So it looks like this. There's only one trait. Analytic, many different criteria, right? You can score them on ideas, content, word choice. Primary trait, you're only grading them one thing. And for that one thing, that's how you assign the point value. Looks like this. Here's the discussion example. Okay, the last one is for people who don't really care for rubrics, I think. Well, or, I don't know. This is a holistic rubric. A holistic rubric is like the one that we're using here for our learning outcomes. So a holistic rubric means I'm evaluating the whole assignment with multiple criteria, but they only get one score. So they would get 3s across the board. So you might have multiple criteria, but they couldn't excel in one area and not do well in another. It would just be across the board a 3. When I taught elementary school, did anybody teach elementary school ever? And we had to grade those state tests. We got trained for hours and hours on how to look at a paper and say it was a 2. And if I said it was a 2 and you said it was a 2, but you said it was a 4, somebody else had to grade that paper for 4 hours. This is what we do in public education, to grade papers. That's a holistic grade. You look at the whole paper, you have multiple criteria, but you give it across the board 1 grade, okay? It's a norming process when you do a rubric like this. This is okay if you want to do a rubric like this, but I highly recommend that your explanations are either very clear for students or you have examples. This is what an A, a B, a C, a D looks like. Because if you're grading something holistically, they need to know what an A looks like. Because you're not giving them a choice to kind of meet the mark in different ways. Okay, so here, see what I'm saying? So this is general area 1, 2, whatever the general area is that you're scoring. Across the board, you got a 2. That's a holistic. So it's fine as long as you have clear expectations and a good model. This is really hard to set up in Canvas. And honestly, the folks from Penn State, I don't think that it's a good model because they're still getting individual scores. So if you want to do a rubric like this, I'll work with you and we'll figure out how to do it in Canvas. Okay, so demo time, but I'm going to show you our Canvas assignment. Okay, how do we do this with scoring guidelines? I'm going to log into Canvas. How do I go to Canvas? learn.maricopa.edu. Memorize that, learn.maricopa.edu. Okay, let me show you a sample assignment here. I'm not going to go over all these logistics. If you don't know how to log into Canvas or how to set up an assignment, you really need to go to one of the Canvas beginning workshops. For this purpose, we're just looking at rubrics, okay? So my stuff is all built in Canvas here. All I want to look at is I've chosen for this hypothetical course that I'm going to link it to Civic Engagement. One of the leading themes for this course, my learning outcome, was civic engagement. This is what I've selected. My students have acquired knowledge, skills, and habits of mind throughout the course, and I have the signature assignment that's going to demonstrate civic engagement for my course that Diana Boland's team is going to be able to access. And even better, I can access it to inform my course design the next time. So, okay, guys, I put this in here last night. Okay, here's the assignment, civic engagement. Okay. Okay, so I have the description of my assignment in here, all this good stuff, what they're going to do. And then I need to create a rubric or add a rubric. So if you already teach a course and you have rubrics, then you're just going to, oh, I need to go back. Okay. I'm going to delete this for a minute. I'm afraid to delete it. I'm not going to delete it. Okay, I'm not going to delete it. I'm going to show you something else. Okay, so if you already have an assignment and a rubric linked to it, you will just end up editing your rubric, and I'm going to show you how here. But if it's a new assignment, you will have a button that says Add Rubric. And when you add rubric, you're going to create your rubric for the assignment. The rubric is how you grade your students, okay? The learning outcomes are how we get institutional data. Let's take a step back because we want to link, we've decided this is my 4Cs assignment. So I need to pull the 4Cs learning outcomes into my course, okay? This is how we do it. I click on Outcomes. I have a how-to guide for those of you who aren't familiar with this, okay? Click on Outcomes, and I'm going to go to Find, and Account Standards, and this is Mesa Community College. Don't click on Obsolete. Please, Diana doesn't like that. We're using these here, MCCs, 4Cs, academic year 15-16. So which C did I say I was going to evaluate? Civic engagement. I only need to choose one assignment and one C and one class if I'm trying this out for the first time. You might want to shoot for the stars and do all your classes. Don't do it. Just do one to get started, okay? One C, one class. I've selected Civic Engagement. I'm going to click on Civic Engagement, and at the bottom of the page, I need to import this. Because I started in the course where the assignment is located, when I import it, it's pulling that learning outcome into that course, okay? Now, I've selected the assignment. I want to add the learning outcome. So I'm going to go back to my assignment. I'm doing the Welcome Kit assignment for Civic Engagement. This is the rubric that I created. Now I'm going to edit it. I need to edit this rubric. And there's a link down here that says Find Outcome. First of all, I checked the box because I'm going to use this rubric for grading the assignment. Make sure that that box is not automatically checked. You have to check it for every assignment that you want to grade for a rubric. I want to use this rubric to grade my assignment. I want to attach learning outcomes because it's going for institutional data. Okay? So I'm going to click Find Outcome, and I've selected, I only have one imported, Civic Engagement. And I only want to do one assignment. There are five learning, did I count that right? Learning outcomes for civic engagement that you have to measure. You might choose when you read the details that you want to measure one with one assignment, one with another, one with another. I wanted it to be more holistic. So that's just, they're all 5 in one assignment. Because it's cumulative at the end of my course, I feel like I can include all of those in it. And for your first time, you may just want to link all of those to the assignment, to one assignment. Rules, though, you can only link them one time to one assignment, right? You can only measure this outcome one time in your course. Or you can link all 5 to one assignment, but only one time. Otherwise, it messes up the data. So I'm going to choose the outcomes that I'm linking here, and I'm going to import them. Okay, I'm going to find the outcome. This is the one I'm measuring. And what Diana said here, I need to unclick Use for Grading. You're not using these for scoring. You're scoring with your rubric. And now I import it. Okay, so currently on this assignment, one of the C's is linked, or one of the C's, civic engagement, and one of the particular outcomes for civic engagement is linked to the assignment. I would want to link all of them because I want to measure all of civic engagement on one assignment. That's my personal preference. Okay? When you go and grade the assignment, so now students have turned it in, and you're going to grade it in SpeedGrader. I won't be able to because students aren't enrolled in this, but when you pull up their assignment in SpeedGrader, you'll see the assignment and the rubric. You just click on the criteria that you want them to get the score and the learning outcome and save it, and it will collect all the data and give the students their score.
Can you do a student?
So this is what it looks like from the student's point of view. The student looks at their assignment. They can see the rubric. When you grade it, you're only clicking on the criteria that are on the rubric, and that gives them their grade. Then you will also give them a score for their achievement for each of the criteria for the learning outcome, but that will not affect that grade because you unchecked that box that said used for grading, right? Okay, so it's a bit overwhelming. So let me show you this resource here. On the CTL website, ctl.mesacc.edu, there are how-to documents. If I click on Services, How-to Documents, and then I go to Canvas, we have a how-to document for learning outcomes right here. There's a gazillion of these. They're wonderful to help you with Canvas, and they have screenshots and everything that give you step-by-step how to do it. I have hard copies here, a few of them, so if you'd like to just take a hard copy, you can, but you can always access this online. Last time I go to ctl.mesacc.edu, I click on Services, How-to Documents. At the top of that page, it will filter for you. I go to Canvas, Guides, and these are all the guides that we have for Canvas. We need to make one for the mobile app, so I'm definitely going to put that on our to-do list. And this is the learning outcomes, competencies, and 4 Cs. Okay? Once you've tried out Canvas, you know the basic fundamentals for using it. And if you're ready for this and you need assistance, that's what the CTL is here to support you to do. So please contact the CTL if you need help once you're ready to link a learning outcome to your course.